Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to this Last Trumpet Bible School. And as you could see, we are doing the next session in the studies on atonement, part 7, and particularly today looking at the blood rituals of the Levitical sacrifices. Now, why would this be important? Well, simply because, in general, those who propagate certain atonement theories lump all of these sacrifices together. And I don't think deliberately, without understanding what these blood rituals were really about, they lump it together and focus it on appeasement of wrath, and the whole focus of the blood rituals are misplaced. And so we need to look at that. We need to understand there are a number of problem questions I want to ask, and some scriptures I want to highlight around the atonement and the blood rituals so that you could see how it's been misinterpreted and why that is so dangerous. Let's begin. So the first point I want to make is this. In the ancient Near East, rituals of sacrifices were widespread. I think there's a problem already. So everybody was sacrificing. The question you and I need to ask is, what made the sacrificial system of the Levites given by God so different? And we need to understand that, because if we misinterpret the Levitical sacrificial system and the blood rituals, what do we end up with? Without thinking, without actually being deliberate, we come to certain atonement theories that doesn't differ from paganism. It basically boils down to appeasement of wrath, and winning favor through sacrificing something. The question we need to ask is, how does the Levitical sacrificial system differ from the pagan system? Because that's exactly what pagans did. Without trying to offend anyone, we need to ask these questions honestly. Now, let's see. You see, crucially, in the priestly tradition, sacrifices was not understood as a means of appeasing divine wrath or of cajoling God to show favor. As a matter of fact, what we will show you today, it was given as a means of atonement, of healing the breach in a covenant relationship and reuniting the people in communion with God. We're going to see that. And I think, look, if you come from a particular viewpoint, this can sound quite offensive, that you are now being told that this actually had nothing to do with appeasement of wrath. If we can prove that, then we need to reconsider our understanding of what Christ did, because normally people use the Levitical sacrifices and the atoning sacrifices specifically, and the laying on of hands as a model for telling us, well, that's what Christ came to do. But what you'll see today, the sacrificial system was not that simple, and it was actually not always involving blood rites or the laying of hands on an animal, and we're going to investigate. The efficacy of the atoning sacrifice lay not in magically satisfying God's anger by symbolically restoring a broken relationship, but in symbolically restoring a broken relationship, provided the worshipper repentance and sincerity of heart. Notably, no sacrifice could be offered for defiant, high-handed sin. Deliberate rebellion was beyond the scope of sacrificial remedy. In other words, if we claim that it's a substitutionary death, then it would have been easy. If somebody was deserving of a death penalty, then just sacrifice a substitutionary animal and then let the guilty party go free. But we'll find in the Levitical system this was not the case. Now, it should be further noted that the sacrificial system consisted of both atoning and non-atoning sacrifices that spoke to the different breaches of the sacred and the profane. So we have a little bit of a complexity here. We have atoning and non-atoning. And under atoning, we have blood and non-blood. Then under atoning sacrifices, we had laying on of hand and not laying on of hand. So it's not that simple, and we need to investigate. And that's the point I'm trying to make this morning. To lump all the sacrifices together and interpret it out of its intended context leads to a gross error in the understanding of the work of Christ. And let me just demonstrate you at the onset what I mean. If we look at atoning sacrifices, you'll see that it speaks to sin offering and guilt offering. But that was limited. Remember last lesson I gave you, we looked at the sacred, the profane, the clean, and the unclean. And we see that atoning sacrifices were not always for deliberate sin either. You could be ritually unclean and you had to be atoned for. So what we see there, as far as the sacred and the profane was concerned, you had two types of sacrifices. Then as far as the clean and the unclean was concerned, you had atoning sacrifices. But overall, for these sacrifices, as far as they are categorized as atoning, you have blood sacrifices and non-blood sacrifices that atone. So now we sit with a problem to generalize and say, well, the death of Christ was this atoning sacrifice, is to make an interpretation mistake, right? Then we have non-atoning sacrifice, which was the burnt offering and the grain offering for the sacred, as far as the sacred and profane is concerned. And we have the peace offering and the thanksgiving offering as far as the clean and the unclean are concerned. So they definitely are categorized. It's not so simple as just to lump them all together, because we see blood in it. And what we'll see, some of the blood sacrifices were not even for atoning. Now we have a further problem. And all I'm trying to do is to confuse you a little bit with the facts today, and then show you that you can't just read into it whatever you want. We have to understand it from a Hebrew perspective. And once again, I'm going to quote extensively from really, in my mind, the best scholars, and not just in my mind, they recognize that the best scholars on the book of Leviticus, and specifically Jacob Milgram, who is a Jewish scholar who spent about 30 years of his life studying the Levitical sacrificial system. And we'll see what he has to say. It's sad, I'm sorry, I just have to throw this in, that some people would, if it doesn't suit their philosophies and doctrines, would say, well, we don't recognize him as so much of a scholar. But fortunately, these people are recognized across the board as scholars on this topic. Now, we have to understand this Levitical sacrificial system correctly, because that has been, as I explained, the traditional basis from which people try and explain the atoning work of Christ, with the emphasis in their minds on appeasing wrath. But is there any such thing mentioned in the Levitical sacrificial system? Let's see. Well, first and foremost, we're going to see that the concept of a substitutionary death is an idea foreign to the Torah. Substitutionary death. I should have died, now he dies in my place. This is an idea imported from specifically Calvinism and as I've explained in the previous theories of atonement, from that whole line from Augustine. They imported this concept of substitutionary death. And we're going to look at the scriptures, all the atonement scriptures in the New Testament, and see how they actually relate to this. So don't get too excited right now. So what we want to determine, is there such a thing as a substitutionary death in the Old Testament? First and foremost. Second, the hand-laying ritual is not saying this is me. In other words, there's not an association with the animal. He's now going to die because I deserve death and I associate with the animal and I transfer the sin. But rather, this is mine. I own this and I'm giving it to God, and that could be for various reasons as a sacrifice and a gift. And we're going to see why that is so. Number 3, the sacrificial slaughter is itself not focused on the biological death of the animal. If death was the issue, if it was to appease wrath by killing something, then you could just break its neck, because then something died. But the focus of the Levitical system is on the blood rituals afterwards, which sanctifies everything. So it was not about killing something. The focus was never on death, and we'll see what the Bible has to say if there's a focus on death. Okay? Sacrificial slaughter is separated from any notion of simply being a death and is explicitly reconceptualized via specific ritual actions as something other than a killing of a blood-bearing creature. You've got to understand that. You see, as far as Western atonement theories are concerned, it's about killing. It's about the death. But as far as the Levitical sacrificial system was concerned, and I'll show it to you from a number of scholars today, it was about life. It was not about the killing. The animal was slaughtered outside, and the blood was carried inside, and the whole process, the whole ritual that sanctified was the application of the blood at various places through various means. The focus was on carrying the life of the blood. Okay. Further, sacrificial slaughter is not at all about making the animal suffer, let alone suffer as a substitute. Now, I must make a comment here. In the previous lectures that I gave on atonement, some, what do you call it, preacher, for the lack of a better word, sent me a long email to tell me that, you know, the rabbis, they kicked the offering, the scapegoat, on the Day of Atonement, quoting a rabbinic literature. Now, I'm not interested in extra biblical literature to try and substantiate a theory. What does the Bible say? It's nowhere found in Torah. As a matter of fact, the moment when a sacrificial animal is tortured and he's marred, he's not perfect anymore, and therefore cannot be accepted as sacrifice. And as a matter of fact, that one animal, the scapegoat, was never sacrificed but released to go out into the wilderness. So let's just get our facts straight. The Bible does not allow the torture of the sacrificial animal as if he is now suffering. And why is that important? Well, because in our modern atonement theory, some claim that, like this man, well, the animal was kicked and slapped and whatever, and therefore Christ was kicked and slapped, is a misinterpretation of the Bible. Okay? That's deliberately not looking at what the scripture is saying. Understanding of the different sacrifices and the required sacrificial animals, including specifically their gender, fundamentally speaks to misunderstanding in atonement doctrine. Why? Because what I did for you is I've laid out for you the different sacrifices, where they fit into the diagram of the sacred, the profane, the clean, and the unclean. And to your astonishment, you will discover the Bible particularly stipulates that no atonement sacrifice of a lamb is allowed to be male. Now we have a problem. If an atonement sacrifice in the Old Testament, as if the offerer brought a lamb, and it was not allowed to be male, we have a problem when we call Jesus Christ the Lamb of God male of the first year. But what we'll discover in the sacrificial requirements, there's one stipulation of a lamb that must be male of the first year. And no other sacrifice was allowed to have the male of the first year. Now, if we look at the sacrificial system and we see the stipulations of the particular animal, that should also influence the way we now read the sacrifice of Christ. Can we just read into it what is not there? We have to stick to the Bible, right? We have to stick to the facts. We can't do eisegesis and read into it what is not there. So these 5 points are clear and easy to read and study in the scriptures and the Levitical sacrifices. Now, let's start with the substitutionary death and make the point. For example, whenever something calls for capital punishment or for the sinner to be cut off, there is no sacrifice that can be made to rectify the situation. So what is the point there? You see, there were certain sins that deserved death. If I claim that a sacrifice functions as a substitute for death, then that would require that this person who was now condemned to death could go to the priest, bring an animal, the animal could die in his stead, and he could go free. However, that was never the case. It's clear that that animal never served that purpose as a substitute for death, because death was never the focus of the sacrificial system. Look at this. But the person, Numbers 15:20, who does anything wrong willfully and openly, whether he is native born or a stranger, that one reproaches, reviles, and blasphemes the Lord, and that person shall be cut off from amongst his people. Now, verse 31, because he has despised and rejected the word of the Lord and has broken the commandment, that person shall be utterly cut off. His iniquity shall be upon him. So there's no remedy. But in the interpretation of most of the atonement theories in the modern world, we look at it and say, well, it's a substitutionary death. But by virtue of the scripture itself, it cannot happen. Numbers 35:31. Moreover, you shall take no ransom for the life of a murderer guilty of death, but he shall surely be put to death. There's no substitute. There's no substitutionary death. Now, folks, all I'm trying to show you is that the sacrificial system was never in the Jewish context and the Levitical context understood to replace or substitute somebody who deserved death. Because it was never a ritual about death, but about life. And you shall accept no ransom for him. Nothing. There's no sacrifice, no ransom. Further, let's make the point. These verses already rules out the idea that death of the sacrificial animal is substituting for the death of the offender. If substitutionary death was the logic of animal sacrifice, then one thing we could expect to be remedied by sacrifice would be the capital offense when the death of the offender is on the line. Clear? The fact that this is explicitly not the case means we need to rethink Old Testament sacrificial systems and to analyze the New Testament sacrificial metaphors with this in mind. Now, folks, I know I'm just closing all the gaps. We're going to look at a number of principles in atonement that we assume. The problem is repetition of mistakes leads to perfection of errors. So a lot of people just assume things because everybody says so. I'll never forget in the previous series, a lady sent me an email. So what would the historic fathers say about your statements on atonement? I'm not the only one who sees and preaches these things. And quite frankly, repetition of mistakes leads to perfection of errors. It doesn't mean because a man claims something about atonement, he actually studied it thoroughly. It could just be an echo chamber for what they've learned. It is not necessarily deliberate. Don't take me wrong. Okay? The whole understanding of substitution implies that God demands the death of the sinner, but he is substituted by an animal, and consequently the animal must be killed. It is not as if God desires human blood on the altar but settles for animal blood instead. In fact, human blood on the altar or in the temple does just the opposite. Human blood defiles. You can't bring human blood near God. It's not that he demands that blood. Okay? Now, let's look at it further. The central goal of Levitical sacrifices was to purify, to maintain ritual access to God's presence, not to satisfy divine wrath through a substitute that is punished. And what you'll see, I actually went through the different portions of Leviticus, and you start there by chapter 1 and you go right through it, and you can break the chapters up with specific emphasis. And what will you discover? What is the textual point? Well, the textual point of the blood rituals given was never substitutionary death. And we're going to talk about the Yom Kippur sacrifice, which is the only sacrifice where there is a so-called laying on of both hands on the scapegoat with a transference of sin. But there are certain things we need to think about because that animal was never killed. He was driven out into the wilderness. Now, quite frankly, Some people again quote extra biblical texts to say, well, they shoved him off a cliff and this and that. I don't find that in the Bible. I'm more concerned with what the Bible says than with what other people try and read into it. So let's use the Bible to see what the Bible has to say. And then what do we see? Throughout, with the main points, we'll find this cleansing. We find no idea of substitutionary death. No passage in Leviticus or the Torah says the animal is punished. How do we read that in there? Because that's what we read in, because that is, you see, we read from our theory back into the script. The animals must be unblemished, and the ritual slaughter is not described in penal terms. Nowhere. Let's get that clear. I can't read into it punishment. I can't read into it substitution if the scripture doesn't explicitly say so. I want to challenge you. Read Jacob Milgram's book on the book of Leviticus and his comment and his extensive study on these blood rituals, and you will understand. Further, this further disproves substitutionary death, which requires a death in place of the sinner. Yet Leviticus provides non-blood sin offerings. Now you see, there's a problem. Okay, wait a minute. If you say that a death must pay, a substitutionary death, then what do you have to say about non-blood sin offering? What do you have to say about that? Because that now leaves us with a problem. Because those also do attain, and I'll show that to you in the diagram that I've drafted at the end of this session. So there is, according to Leviticus 5, 11, 13, a grain offering which is accepted as a sin offering if the person is poor. The Bible says the person shall be forgiven. The conclusion, there are a number of these verses that I've included for you on the diagram. If sin can be atoned without death, then death is not a substitute or penalty for sin in the Levitical system. Do you understand that? It's so important because we have forced a connection that the Bible doesn't state in the book of Leviticus. Now, let's go on. Animals are not moral beings, but according to substitutionary theory, they must take on the moral guilt of the transgressor and suffer the due punishment. Nowhere are the animal declared guilty by way of transference by the priest. Folks, I mean, I am drilling down a little bit into detail that for some might be too much. But we have to address certain assumptions, because this is what is assumed. People assume animals are not moral beings. Nowhere does the Bible say they are guilty because my guilt now moves onto them, and nowhere does the priest even declare that. Okay. The blood and not the death is central, and we're going to have a look at that now. Okay. According to the Old Testament, the God of Israel abhors human sacrifice. It is the pinnacle of false worship. I mean, guys, all I'm trying to show you here is, by implication, if I force the substitutionary death thing onto the Levitical sacrificial system, then I am saying God demands actually a human life. But he's now accepting a substitute for it. And what we are further saying is this. Look, Leviticus 18:21. You shall not give any of your children to pass through the fire. Leviticus 22. Moreover, you shall not say to the Israelites, any of the Israelites, or of the strangers that sojourn in Israel, who gives any of his children to Molech. So, what we are also saying is this. God abhors human sacrifice. He makes it clear. I mean, these are 1, 2, 3, 4 scriptures that states that. Now question. Does he require a human sacrifice in the New Testament? if he explicitly states in the Old that he abhors it? If it's connected to paganism, then the question you and I, in all fairness, need to ask, was that a human sacrifice demanded by God to appease wrath, or is there something else that I'm missing? Is the focus on the blood ritual, as it was the focus in the book of Leviticus? And you will discover in the book of Hebrews, it goes into an extensive explanation of the blood that cleanses in the sanctuary in heaven. And I think we need to consider that. What makes it different? What makes the sacrificial system of the Levitical priesthood different than paganism? It should be clear to you already, the Lord abhors human sacrifice. Can he therefore demand it in the New Testament? Did he change? Or is there something we're missing? By now I can hear some people's blood boiling, but that's okay. Nobody is denying the death of Christ. What we are questioning is how we understand how it works. And we're going to go back to the Old Testament to find out exactly how it works. How did they see it, and how are we supposed to interpret it? Further, you shall not do so to the Lord your God, for every abominable thing which the Lord hates they have done for their gods. For even their sons and their daughters they have burned in the fire to their gods. And they have built the high places of Topheth, which is the valley of Ben Hinnom. Now look at what he says. He says, don't go and do as they did. Don't go do as they did. Logically, then, the atoning blood of atoning sacrifices cannot be construed as substituting for the death or the blood of the offerer. There is no warrant anywhere in the Old Testament that through animal sacrifices God is accepting animal blood on the altar instead of the ostensibly more ideal human blood. There's no place found. If I read Leviticus 17:11, it clearly states, the life of the soul is in the blood. I have given it to you to make atonement for your souls. Not appeasement. Atone is to cover, to cleanse, so that there could be reconciliation. It's not something man gives to God, it's something God gives to man, with the emphasis on life. So the focus of the ritual is on the life. Okay? Further. What about the laying on of hands on the animal? Because even I was taught this way at different places that I studied. See, there's a transference of guilt. Transference. Now the animal becomes guilty. I associate myself with the death of the animal. Even I taught that to my own shame years ago. Oh. Anyway, thank God that I came to better understanding and insight. Anyway, one reason some assume sacrifice is substitutionary death is because certain sacrifices call for the offerer to lay a single hand on the animal. The mistaken idea is that this gesture means the animal is substituting for the offerer, who should really be the one that must die. See that? But the fact that there is no such a thing as a substitutionary death sacrifice automatically excludes this as a possibility. Notice, please notice, there's another sacrifice called the well-being sacrifice, which is a non-atoning, which have nothing to do with the atoning function, are one of the sacrifices that require a single hand laying gesture. Now I'm asking you the question, if it was about association with the guilt and the death of the animal now, or the transfer of guilt, why on earth would you need to lay your hand on an animal that's got nothing to do with atoning, but with a thanksgiving, well-being? So if you just glibly read over the scriptures and you have a picture in your mind because somebody told you this is what's happening, and you don't read the scriptures properly and all the sacrifices, you're going to misread it. If it was a standard that atoning sacrifices should have the hand laying practiced, then why In certain atoning sacrifices, there was no hand laying, and in certain well-being sacrifices, there was hand laying. This is an inconsistency that you need to consider before you come to a conclusion. Leviticus 3:11, if a man's offering is a sacrifice or a peace offering, he's offering an animal from the herd, whether male or female, he shall offer it without blemish before the Lord. He shall lay his hand upon the head. Oh, there we have a offering, a peace offering. Put your hand on it. It's not atoning. And then we read in verse 8, he shall lay both his hands on the head of his offering and kill it before the tent of meeting, and Aaron's son shall throw its blood around against the floor, against the altar, and lay his hand upon his head and kill it therefore at the tent of meeting, and the sons of Aaron shall throw its blood against the altar round about. That's 13:3. And this is a peace offering. So we have two types of peace offerings, two different ways of laying on of hands, one with one hand, one with both hands, but it's got nothing to do with atonement. It's got nothing to do with transfer of guilt, with associating with the death of the animal, transferring of sin onto the animal. That, dear friends, is reading into the text what is not there. That will necessarily lead you to a misunderstanding. Now, let's see. The people I'm now quoting is Jacob Milgram, and then also Feldman, and then Balberg, which is blood for thought. Now, these people all studied blood rituals. This is what they have to say. The guilt offering, which is one of the atoning sacrifices, does not require a hand gesture. These two offerings prove that whatever the single hand gesture means, it cannot mean substitutionary death or transfer of sin. The non-atoning well-being offering requires the hand gesture, whereas the atoning guilt offering does not. Can you see? It's not so simple. We have read into it what is not there. Through this double laying hand ritual result in the placement of the sins on the goat's head, that is on the Day of Atonement, it should not be considered a transfer of sin in a strict sense, because what's going to happen here, if Aaron the high priest lays both his hands on the animal, and what do we see here? The double hand laying results in the placements of sin on the goat. Does that imply Aaron is carrying all the sins and then transferring it onto the goat? We have to understand the ritual. And then furthermore, we have to note that this animal is not even killed, but released to go into the wilderness. Okay, so somehow in the atonement theories that came up in the modern age, the picture that came across was there was a laying on of hands to transfer the guilt from the high priest to the animal, and that the animal was consequently guilty, substituting for the guilt of the guilty party and taking the death of the guilty party upon himself, and then he was led off into the wilderness to die. What is the problem with that? Well, the problem is when we get to the death of Christ, the high priest didn't acknowledge Christ as the substitute. The high priest never laid his hands on Christ. The high priest never killed him. Okay? They never acknowledged him even as the Messiah. And now we are taking the model we see with a lot of misinterpretation into the New Testament to make it say what it's not, because we don't study the festivals either. What I will show you, for example, in the festivals, the first 4 had to do with the first coming. The last 3 has to do with the second coming. Matthew 25 clearly states when he returns, he's going to separate the sheep and the goats. Then the sinner will carry away his own sin and be removed from the holy city. Anyway, let's go further. The sins are not passed from Aaron through his hands to the goat. Aaron never carries or embodies these evils. Consequently, one cannot say that sins are transferred. Rather, the placement of the sins is effected by both the hand placement gesture, which designates where the sin are to rest, and the spoken confessions which exemplify the sins when then fall on the head of the goat. In other words, they confess something. There's nothing transferred from one to the other. I think we need to see and understand this. Further, laying on of hands. While the laying on of two hands connotes designation, the laying on of a single hand conveys the notion of ownership. The rite is not intended to express some abstract identification between the offerer and the offering. It is not intended to say this offering represents me. Rather, the statement is more concrete and practical. The offerer puts his single hand on the offering to state, this offering is mine and I bring it. And you can read their Clavans in Purity and Sacrifice. Excellent books, folks, I can highly recommend. Further, we read in Leviticus 16:21, and Aaron shall lay both hands upon the head of the live goat and confess over him all the iniquities of the Israelites and all their transgressions and all their sins. So he tells us where it's going to lay, and it's just by virtue of confession saying that, and symbolically that goat is separated, cut off, and he takes away those sins. The single hand gesture is distinguished from the double hand gesture which occurs on the Day of Atonement, although only upon the goat that is not sacrificed and remains alive. I'm just saying. You see, the problem we run into now is if we force Yom Kippur symbolism onto the crucifixion, we get a lot of conflicts. Because as far as Yom Kippur is concerned, the atonement sacrifice was led away, or the atonement, the goat that carried the sin on which there was a transfer was led away. He wasn't physically killed by the priest. And the other animal was killed. Again, they are goats. They are not referred to as a lamb. And so we have a problem. And honestly, guys, we need to think about this. We need to see that there is a continuity in our argument, and it is logical and reasonable. We can't override principles already established in the Old Testament and then reinterpret everything in the New. As I pointed out previously, especially because when we look at the English translation, we look at the word atonement in the Old Testament, and then we look at it in the New Testament, and we naturally make a connection instead of looking at the root words, finding that Christ is our mercy seat, the place where God meets man, the one that is the mediator between God and man. Because if we look at it without understanding what the word means, we import a lot of assumptions from Leviticus which we actually never studied. And that's why I'm throwing out these challenges. Now, further, Leviticus 12 verse 6, when the days of her purification are complete, whether of a son or for a daughter, she shall bring a lamb a year old for a burnt offering, and a young pigeon or a turtle dove for a sin offering. Okay? And he shall offer it before the Lord and make atonement for her, and she shall be cleansed from a flow of her blood. This is the law for her who has borne a male or a female child. If she is unable to bring a lamb, then she shall bring 2 turtle doves or a young pigeon, one of the burnt offering, the other one for a sin offering. What's the point? No laying on of hands here, and no sin committed, just uncleanness, but again an atonement sacrifice. Then, let's see what Jacob Milgram has to say in his excellent book on Leviticus. The presentation of small offerings in the hand of the offerer is enough to designate the offering as pertaining to that person. Not transference of guilt, not associating with his death, but this is what I bring you as a gift. Okay? Because they are small, they are held in the hand, they are given to the priest, and that designates ownership. No hand placement rite is therefore necessary. In contrast, one can imagine that with the larger quadrupeds, several persons may have been required to move a stubborn animal into proper possession. Or in the case of women bringing an offering. That's a woman. She's not strong. She needs other people. Other men may have led the animal into the sanctuary court. Confusion as to who was actually bringing the animal may have ensued. Therefore, hand placement needed to be performed with a larger animal to indicate the sacrifice and allay any possible confusion of attribution. It's mine. That's why I stand there with my hand on it. The fact that non-atoning sacrifices require it, but certain atoning sacrifices do not, as well as the textual and contextual validated distinctive function of single versus double hand laying, all militate against a substitutionary understanding. How profound. Thank you, Jacob Milgram. Excellent. That's what we needed to clarify. Then, we need to understand the scope of this thing. It's not so easy. And this is what I did for you. Not all atoning sacrifices dealt with sin. Some required the laying on of a hand and some not. The point being made is that has no relation with the transfer of guilt or death by substitution, but it had an entirely different focus. That's where I'm leading to, guys. As I said, this is a mere introduction. There is so much to say about it. I'm leading you into something that you can see for yourself. And here, for your own leisure, I've given you a detailed description of the different sacrifices, where you can find it in the Bible, who's supposed to bring the sacrifice, and what the Bible said, whether there was blood implied or not. And once we've done this little bit of homework, what will we discover? Sins could be forgiven by something that there was no blood involved. A person could be forgiven without the laying on of hands. And I think the most important conclusions we can make from this, reasonable conclusions as per the scholars, is that it had nothing to do with substitutionary death. The focus of that sacrifice was never on a death. The whole focus was the ritual afterwards. And I want to highlight the following for you, please. The sacrifice was never about death. Let's look at it. The life of the animal is in the blood, and I've given it for you upon the altar to make atonement for your souls. Let's look at it. For it is the blood that makes atonement by reason of life. What makes atonement? Death. The Bible states it in your face. Life makes atonement. What was the ritual about then? Life. Who gave it? It's not something man brings to appease God and to move the hand of God and to appease his wrath. It's something God gave because in that blood is life. And life will atone for your soul. It's unbelievable. Look how I'm going to read it again. For the life of the animal soul is in the blood, and I have given it for you. Not man giving it to God. I've given it for you. It's God's provision upon the altar to make atonement for your souls. For, now look how he ends it. For it is the blood that makes atonement, and now he puts the emphasis, by reason of the life. So what is the focus of the Levitical blood sacrificial system? It's the manipulating of the blood in the temple. How it's applied, because it represents life. Sin represents death, represents separation. It represents uncleanness. And I'm going to do the metaphors for sin to understand atonement better, combined with all the metaphors for atonement. And then what do you see? As far as we are concerned in the West, we have focused on it must be the killing. You know, he got killed. Well, if it was about the killing, then why mention anything about the resurrection? Because now God's satisfied, right? Nothing else is mentioned. But this is not the model of the Old Testament Levitical priesthood. What do we see there? The ritual is all about accessing life and bringing that life into the presence of the living God. Death cannot be brought into sacred space without defiling it. If this was about soaking your hands in blood to show that you've killed, you've been influenced by Hollywood. You see, we associate blood with vengeance, with evil things, with destruction. But as far as the Bible's concerned, since there's no torture, there's no cruelty involved, it's the sacrifice of that animal to extract the blood for the presentation of the blood in the holy place, and the focus of it being on life. That's what we see from the Bible. If we look at it at the world, out of the world's point of view, we see that we've been influenced by how sick the world is and how they think about blood. And it's natural for us to import it into how we understand the work of the cross. Oh, it must be about wrath. It must be about justice satisfied. And we're going to talk about that. Because nowhere is that model given here in the Old Testament. They are already in covenant. They are invited to come back into covenant. The means of it, the way to cleanse, is by virtue of blood. Now, death cannot be brought into the holy place. Why is that an important statement? Well, simply because if it was about a death and you bring the blood in, it would defile the whole place. Don't you know that if a person in the Old Testament killed an animal without dedicating the life blood at the temple, it is constituted a killing, a slaughter, a murder. And that person had to be cut off from the people. Even if the animal was slaughtered for the sake of food, the blood was sacred because in it was the life. If you slaughtered a wild animal, there was a way that the blood had to be buried in the sand so as to be kept sacred. But blood has become unclean for us in the filthy world we live in. Anyway, death cannot be brought into the sacred spaces. If that's true, it should be clear to you that this bringing of blood supersedes, override the fact that a death took place outside, because it's not there where the focus is. It's what has been extracted. Anyway, let's go further and make a few comments before I end off. I'll have to go on next week on this very important topic. Now, let's see what Jacob Milgram has to say. Not only can death itself not be brought into sacred space, but also nothing and no one associated with death via ritual impurity can be brought into sacred space. So if the priest slayed the animal, he killed something, that would defile him, right? That would make him unfit to go into the most holy place. You see where the focus is? As far as Western atonement theory is concerned, it's focused on death. But the Levitical practice was never focused on death. It was about the life in the blood that was extracted. The point being that the death is outside, the blood is carried in, and now, as they say, the blood is manipulated, it is used to sanctify everything else. Therefore, thinking that a sacrifice is conceptualized as a death, or substitutionary or not, the greatest and most patent source of a ritual impurity. It's ritual impurity if it's about death, which is then brought into the direct presence of God, fundamentally misunderstands the conceptual framework of Levitical ritual and ontology. Do you see? I mean, folks, I'm quoting from people that are really serious scholars. Somebody who dedicates 30 years of his life in the book of Leviticus is a serious man. And being a real Jew, he actually understands the language that he studies, and that makes a whole difference. According to Leviticus, although indeed an animal literally dies in word, and this is an important statement that he made, via the whole ritual process, how the animal dies, where it dies, what happens to its body and blood afterwards, the death of the animal is conceptualized and configured so that what they just took place was not a killing, but a sacrifice. And the sacrifice itself will take a different meaning and significance depending on the function of the particular sacrifice being affected. It's not a killing, it's a giving. That's why the emphasis is not to substitute, but here's something I give, but I give what it represents is life. And that's why the Son of God gave his life. The Lord doesn't accept human sacrifice, but when the Son of Man gives his life within the context of the Levitical priesthood and brings his own blood, Everything is sanctified. It's a giving, a whole of himself giving. That's completely different from death, wrath, and substitute. Now, so a sacrifice is further construed either as a sacred gift, see there, or when used for kippur, into a ritual detergent. I didn't write this, folks. I'm quoting you from his book. A ritual detergent. Something that cleanses, because sin has been portrayed as uncleanness. It defiles the sanctuary. It ritually cleanses. And that's why we read in the New Testament, time after time, go read 1 John 1. His blood cleanses. Not appeases, cleanses. Okay? So, the validity of either of these purposes depends upon the sacrifice being transfigured into something completely separate from anything having to do with the concept of death. Folks, do you understand how important these statements are? I'm telling you, it's not a substitutionary death. It's not the death that the Lord wants. He's not after that. It's about the life and the blood that restores existing covenant. Okay? Now, let me read further from Willie Plain in a book on the remarks of Hebrew, and this is profound, and that's why I'm quoting it. The blood rites from animal sacrifices, though they differ depending on the specific sacrifice and its specific function, comes into play precisely as a way of ritually reconceptualizing the slaughter away from the realm of death, transforming the event into a non-killing and the procurement of the life-giving and purifying blood. That is by Rolera, a lamb of the free. Brilliant insight, basically reiterating what Jacob Milgram is saying. Then I read for Willie Plain in that book on Hebrews. In short, Leviticus 7 makes it clear that sacrifice functions within a ritual ontology wholly distinct from the realm of death. In Leviticus' controlled environment of sacrifice, the tension to the way things are, that's the animal killing, with the way things ought to be, that is the human living in harmony with God and not killing, is dissolved because the cultic ritual makes it possible to reorientate the whole process around accessing life. That is, the ritual makes it so that the event of sacrifice is not at all about death, but rather a presentation of life. So how does Levitical sacrifices differ from the pagan sacrificial system? Simple. Theirs was to appease an angry God or to win his favor by killing, and they still do that today in different organizations. Guess what? How does the Levitical sacrificial system differ? Well, number one, they respect life. They never tortured the animal. They never were cruel to it. It had to be perfect. And it was not about a death. Their whole focus was on the presentation of the purging blood. Because it was given by God, it represents life. It's an ultimate sacrifice. To get that life, it had to be extracted at the cost of that animal. But it's the focus. That which sanctifies everything was the fact that the blood was brought. No focus on death. Now, why would I hammer that? Well, simply because people in the New Testament era decided that the focus must be on death. And they try and motivate it from the Levitical sacrificial system, which cannot be done. There's no such a verse in the Old Testament, and no worthy scholar of the book of Leviticus will substantiate that. And I've got to just read this to you. 2 more slides, then I'm finished for today. If anyone of the house of Israel slaughtered an ox or a lamb or a goat in the camp, or slaughtered it outside the camp, and does not bring it to the entrance of the tent of meeting, to present it as an offering to the Lord before the tabernacle of the Lord, he shall be held guilty of bloodshed. Can you see where the focus is? Blood, life. Failure to comprehend the significance of Leviticus ritual reconfiguration of these seemingly mundane events, which to the untrained eye makes ritual sacrifice look like a plain and simple death, has led to interpretation of Christian theologies that are not only exegetically inaccurate, but are downright dangerous. Now, I didn't write this, I just read it from fantastic scholars here, and that's Scott Schauf in his book, Jesus the Sacrifice. Now, further he says that the death of the animal, the slaughter itself, is given no ritual or theological meaning by any biblical text. There's no emphasis on death. No emphasis. Because here we import a piece of Catholic imagery from the Passion, right? It's all about the suffering, the whipping, the this and the that. And out of that, we sort of motivated from Isaiah 53. And we're going to look at that in detail, I promise you. We have ideas. But let's get back to the foundation from where we make these conclusions. When we go back to the Old Testament and the book of Leviticus, what do we see? Do we see any of these images? Does scholarly study tell us that this is in actual fact the case or not the case? I'm currently on book number 103 on the Atonement, and I haven't found anyone who studies the book of Leviticus who could motivate substitutionary death, transfer of guilt, and a focus on death. It doesn't exist. Note that the slaughter of the animal is mentioned only in verse 29. It's not the focus. The great part of the ritual focus on what is to be done with the different parts of the animal offerer after it is killed. Note also that it is the offerer, the one who has sinned, who slaughters the animal, while the priest performs all the rituals with the blood and the fat. Since it's the priest who is said to make atonement for the offerer in atonement, not the slaughter itself. In other words, the guy who transgressed slaughtered, so it can't be the focus. The atonement comes when the priest steps in and works the blood and the fat. Okay. This does not square well with the idea that the sacrifice atones via substitution, because in the idea of substitution, the death of the animal in place of the offerer is the focus. If the substitution of the animal for the offerer were the key to understanding the whole act, why would the ritual performed after the slaughter be identified specifically as what atones? Moreover, why would not the priest do the slaughtering? I think case closed, but just to make sure it's really closed, I want to read the last quotes for you. The priestly texts lack any indication that this ritual element, that is the act of killing the animal, had specific significance. The means that ritualized killing is not the purpose of cultic sacrifice in the Hebrew Bible, this means, and killing alone does not qualify a given set of activities as a sacrifice. The fact that sacrificial killing involves accessing blood means that something other than death, quote, death, is being activated. The blood, is the vehicle or agent of the victim's life, and the converse of this point is that the death of the slaughter of the victim, while necessary to procure the blood, has no particular atoning significance in and of itself. I don't know if you understand how important this basic understanding is. If we get this right, it will govern us in a correct understanding when you study the book of Hebrews, for example, or all the figures of speech of atonement in the New Testament. And here I reference Moffat, whose comments on Leviticus. Again, acknowledged scholars. A bloodless breaking of the animal's neck or some such would suffice as a sacrifice if all that mattered was the death of the animal. I reference here Relera and the Book of the Lamb and of the Free. Killing as a concept is what happens when an animal is slaughtered for any other reason or in any other place, or when its blood is not properly handled. If any of the requirements from Leviticus 17 is violated, then the entire event is perceived as belonging to the realm of death, and thus the person is guilty of shedding blood. Folks, I think what we're saying to each other today is that there are certain fundamentals that we have assumed. Now, not always deliberately. We have become echo chambers of the errors of men, and we assume that because men are sincere, that they must be right, but they can be sincerely wrong, because fathers said so, that they knew what they were talking about. Repetition of mistakes leads to perfection of errors. We have to rethink our foundations. Do we understand it even correctly? Have we studied the book of Leviticus properly? Do we understand the sacrificial system? Now, I don't claim to understand it, but thank God there are men who do, whom I've studied. And that I share gladly with you, because once this is clarified, we can now go on into the New Testament to interpret correctly, because for too long, this has been used as imagery, okay, that is very disturbing and come to the wrong conclusion on atonement. If you're like me, you would also struggle on the inside, because how does this line up with all the other doctrines on the character of God, and how does this work differently from paganism? Can you now see why this is important? Can you see why it's so important to dig into it and clarify it for the sake of all of us, so that we can go on and correctly apply the interpretation of the New Testament text? I thank you. I pray to God we'll have some time next week to carry on along these lines. There are quite a number of very important statements I still need to make, and they all revolve around the blood rituals of the Levitical priesthood. Amen.